Hola y bienvenidos a Cuba Today. Today I have with me Señor Holt and some ideas about Master. Señor Holt, what gave you the idea to bring the Toastmasters to Cuba?
Well, good morning, Kissy, and good morning, everyone. I grew up in southern Texas, so I was around the Hispanic culture my entire early part of my life. And what really got me interested in Cuba was my Spanish teacher in high school was Cuban, which made for some interesting Spanish because I was in South Texas where it's the Spanish spoken there is the Mexican variety, and I was speaking Spanish with a Cuban accent, which was really odd to have this white kid in South Texas near Mexico speaking with a Cuban accent. And I really like the Cuban music. I like the Cuban way of life, the kind of relaxed, easy lifestyle of Cuba, and that's what really got me interested into Cuba. And then bringing Toastmasters, I've been in Toastmasters for several years, so the connection between Cuba and Toastmasters, it just kind of came real natural for me.
Sí, muy bien. Thank you, Mr. Holt. Thank goodness I don't have an accent. And Mr. Holt, what could Toastmasters do for Cubanos?
Toastmasters can bring a lot to Cubans because now Cuba has to deal with people on the international stage, and you have to communicate very well if you're going to be on the international stage. Toastmasters' mission is communication and education, and that's what we could bring to the average Cuban. If you're going to engage in work or education or really any kind of communication internationally, you need to be able to express yourself and express yourself very well. Like the language used locally, I mean, that's good, and colloquialism, that's great. But when you're on a global scale and global communications, you really have to be able to communicate well, and that's Toastmasters' business. That's exactly what we do for a living. That's the purpose of Toastmasters. And to be able to communicate better, that's going to help Cubans with job growth. It's going to help their personal communications, their education, having interactions with the rest of the world now as things are opening up in Cuba. And just kind of the history of Cuba within the last 50 years, obviously in 1960, the doors were closed off in Cuba as Fidel Castro took over. And United States and Cuba had a very, very tense relationship until about 2009 when President Obama began to open up relations with Cuba. And in 2011, things really began to open up. And now there's a great opportunity for Toastmasters to come into Cuba and to start some clubs there so they can help your average Cuban with communication and leadership skills.
Gracias, Señor Holt. We do have one leader in Cuba, and it is Fidel Castro. And what are some barriers to bringing Toastmasters to Cuba?
Well, because the relationship between Cuba and the United States has, as I mentioned, been very strained. We were at war, of course, the Bay of Pigs back in the 1960s. We were at war with each other in some ways, and of course the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's a lot of animosity built up between their leadership and our leadership here. I think now with the generations, 50, 60 years old since those the Cuban Missile Crisis, since those disagreements happened, I think a lot of that's gone away with the normal just your average population. But the old leadership still has that animosity, and there's an animosity in Cuba against capitalism because they've been dealing with communism for so long. And I think as time goes on, you'll find that kind of melting. But right now there is still a resistance to everything United States. They don't want the United States coming in and taking over, what they've grown here in Cuba. And of course, that's not the case. Toastmasters is an international organization. We primarily are American, but we are an international organization.
Bueno, gracias, Señor Holt. We do have one name for Americanos, and save that for after. And what does the future look like for Toastmasters in Cuba?
You see, the future is brillante. I think there's a great opportunity here for Toastmasters and for Cubans to get together and to learn and communicate, and I think it's going to be really awesome. I think this is an opportunity that we really should jump on, and it's going to be fantastic.
Muchas gracias, Señor Holt. And that answers all of our questions, but we have some questions here from the listeners. And some of the questions, first one is, what is your background with the Toastmasters?
Kissy, I am a distinguished Toastmaster, which is the highest rank in Toastmasters. You have to complete many different manuals and give a lot of speeches. I think I'm up to 103 speeches now. And I've assumed some leadership within the state, but this is kind of my first international leadership opportunity in Toastmasters. But I'm a pretty experienced Toastmaster. It's been in it since 2011.
Gracias. And Juan wants to know how long before Cuba becomes the world champion of public speaking?
Well, I hope very soon. There's been a lot of great international speakers, and of course, the Cuban people speak with passion and a great flavor in their language. The Cuban style of Spanish is very entertaining to listen to. I think that you'll find that there are some great speakers, and eventually, I have no doubt that there could very well be a world champion speaker come out of Cuba.
That is increíble. And our last question here is from Sulaimi, and she wants to know, what do you envision for the future of Toastmasters in Cuba?
I think the future is incredibly open. I think that the opportunity is there for us to begin this great learning experience with Toastmasters and communication and leadership. I think the future is... the immediate future is going to be a little patchy as we get things started here and get rid of some of the animosity. But I think within the next 10 to 15 years, you're going to definitely see Toastmasters and a growth in international relationships between Cuba and the rest of the world. And I hope Toastmasters is part of that.
Yes, me too. Bueno, Señor Holt, so much for coming here and visiting with us today and for answering our questions. And everybody can tune in to next week's show.